Phil and concern the issue of communications and eventually using helikites or heliostats for long-range communications to support the operations at sea quite a ways from the islands, for example, from the Azores or also from other places. So that was the first contribution. The second one came from Christina, and the concern was, let's say, running some experiments, kind of a high sea. High sea is kind of quite a ways from the islands, and the suggestion would be pretty much to be somewhere halfway between Azores and Bermuda, so that you could be at, let's say, close to the Sargasso Sea and at the same time close to the Azores and run some experiments there and learn more about what is going on there, especially in what concerns the kind of Sargasso seaweed, and there's also the issue of fishing vessels. Then we had contributions from analytics. Okay, so the question was, let's say, how to use their tools for studying the behavior of ships. And then it occurred to us, let's say, this can trigger a discussion concerning, for example, relating the behavior of the ships to the position of, or to the location of seamounts, because seamounts sometimes are used for illegal fishing. So eventually there's a way of connecting those, and that would be kind of interesting, let's say, connection. Then Philip also mentioned, and this makes lots of sense, the issue of the subtropical convergence zone, which can also be, let's say, quite relevant for these studies, and then again, also quite relevant for what you guys are doing. And the issue eventually of doing some stuff there, because, let's say, if you move with the kind of this kind of sort of this patch of water, then you'll be able to see what is going on around it. So instead of having some fixed positions. There's also the issue of, let's say, when you have seamounts, there's also the issue of the eddies that you can spot eventually from the air, from space. So you can combine lots of different, let's say, data coming from different let's say, from satellite, from measurements at sea or so, and to learn much more about what is going on with shipping, let's say, with fishing vessels, and not only. There's also another concern, which is the issue of drug trafficking, which is a kind of different behavior. Then, and please interrupt me if I'm skipping, let's say, some of the notes. Trackwell mentioned the issue of geofencing, and we also asked them about the issue of, okay, so talk about Portugal. I think it would be very difficult to convince fishermen to have devices, let's say, trackers on board their vessels. And the question was more how to convince them about that. And of course, there's a kind of legal aspect to it, but there's also kind of the issue of incentives. So probably you could think of some incentives to address that issue. Then liquid robotics. You guys mentioned something that is, I think, is very relevant, which is the issue of fusing data coming from different sources. And one suggestion was from Phil was having, let's say, addressing that in terms of layers that you could have on top of, let's say, Google. So a kind of layered approach to address this issue, and then you could turn on and off some, let's say, some of these layers. So this is one aspect concerning more kind of data fusion, kind of sort of large-scale data fusion. There was also another aspect which is quite different, which is a kind of a local data fusion. So you have an asset in the ocean, you're collecting data, for example, acoustics, visual, AIS or so, and eventually you should have some sort of data fusion on board so that you can basically save, at least compress data when you need to send data using SATCOMs or something like that. So local data fusion will save you at least some money in what concerns satellite communication. Then Charlotte Fick mentioned the issue, which I think is very relevant in the sense that, again, Google, which is getting data sets into 4D in real time. So kind of 4D data sets in real time. Then there was also the issue of getting data sets basically from NASA, correct me if I'm wrong, and looking at those data sets that cover basically Sargasso Sea and eventually trying to extend those up to the Azores and look at what is useful in those data sets and trying to figure out what is useful for what we are discussing here. Then we had some contributions concerning going back to the issue of seamounts. So we have lots of seamounts in the Atlantic. Actually, you have much more seamounts in the Pacific, right? But still, we have a kind of some seamounts in the Atlantic. And the question is, first of all, it would be nice to have a kind of precise idea of where are those located, because we still, let's say, some of them are still uncharted. Then there's also the issue of precise bathymetry, and not only that, also measurements on the water column, because those are very interesting for, let's say, I'm not into biology, I'm not an expert, but let's say people in, let's say, biology and people in, let's say, oceanography, we find it quite useful to look at that type of data. Then a completely different question coming, let's say, from an engineer. This is basically sail drone contribution, which is the issue of if you're going after, let's say, different types of vessels or so, and if you want to target them for different reasons, and I guess trying to summarize his contribution, the idea is pretty much to come up with a sort of a taxonomy of, say, let's hold those threats for the moment, in lack of a better word. And because if you come up with a taxonomy of those, say, vessels, threats, or whatever you want to call them, then you can also target and you can also think of, okay, for this type of threats, I need this type of vehicles, and these vehicles should be configured in this configuration, in that configuration. So I think this makes lots of sense. And finally, there was one contribution concerning how to use kind of satellite data, and more in the sense of targeting precise events happening in the ocean. And this was pretty much the last contribution before we had to adjourn. So we didn't have much time to come up with a long list of the comments. But anyway, these are the main conclusions. And if you ask me, let's say, okay, then you have any suggestions, I think that probably we should keep discussing these issues and keep, let's say, the kind of discussions going eventually, let's say, after this meeting, because we reach the stage where we have some, let's say, common understanding of what is going on. We learn a lot here, but the question is, how do we get, let's say, so tomorrow, a few days or so, probably we should do more about what we've been discussing here. So trying to promote something that will at least address the issue of cooperation and how do we do more with what we have. Because I think that let's say, if you look at what we have, different technologies, different institutions or so, definitely I think that we can do much more if we really talk and cooperate. And so this is pretty much, I think this is the summary, right?